So it's my pleasure to welcome everyone back to the second day of the 29th Annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium on the clean energy transition. Let me say thank you for rejoining us this morning here in the room on the 6th floor of the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. To those of you online joining us, let me thank you also for rejoining us for the second day of the symposium when we begin to further pull together the various threads that make up this most important and exciting transition to clean energy. I'm Bob Keiter, incidentally, director of the Wallace Stegner Center. And let me begin my brief remarks this morning with our native lands acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So one quick announcement respecting upcoming program for the Wallace Stegner Center. That is that our environmental dispute resolution program is currently accepting applications for the 2024 Collaboration Certificate course. This 7-session online course teaches mid and upper level professionals working on environmental, natural resource, and public policy issues, the quote, art and science of collaborative problem solving. Applications are due April 22nd, and for more information, you can check the website, adr.program@law.utah.edu. Let me once again extend my personal and institutional gratitude to our funders who have made this symposium possible. And they include the R. Harold Burton Foundation, actually the founding donor for the Stegner Center's annual symposium, the Cultural Vision Fund, which not only helps support the symposium, but also a number of other Stegner Center programs, and the Nature Conservancy of Utah that has for several years now provided us with important support for the symposium and has been an important partner for the Stegner Center. I'll repeat what I said yesterday morning regarding logistics in case anyone has forgotten. A few quick announcements on this. First, in the interest of time, we will only introduce speakers by name and title. Full biographical information about our speakers is available on the symposium website. As everyone has already discovered here, there's food in the lobby, and you're welcome to bring that here into the moot court room during the course of the day. If you need to leave, please take advantage of the side doors and exit quietly so as not to interrupt the proceedings. For our question and answer session, we'll use the Slido device as reflected on the screen. This King's English Bookshop, which has been with us at the symposium for just about since the beginning, will be selling books in the lobby, both books from our speakers, from Wallace Stegner's vast collection of works, and for other relevant books. So please stop by their table in the lobby. Those who need a State of Utah continuing legal education program, continuing legal education credit, please remember to sign up on the symposium website. We've got online evaluations of the symposium program, and I'd encourage you to fill them out. They're helpful to us in planning for next year and also helpful in our work with our donors and supporters. Let's see. Final point, silence cell phones if you haven't already. And with that, I'm going to turn the rest of this early part of the morning over to my colleague, Professor Brigham Daniels, who will provide us a further roadmap into where we've been and where we are headed with the symposium. So Brigham, please come up. Thank you.
I'll bring this to you.
Yeah, it's fine.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay. Well, welcome. Just if I may, do we have still in the house our Highland High School students who were present yesterday? There they are. There they are. Hey, I just have to say to you, I've had a number of people comment that your presence here alone has made them more hopeful, and we really want to extend a warm welcome to you. Welcome. If I can just take another couple points of having the microphone and just some hope that no one's going to take me away from this for a second. Two other things. I just want to acknowledge that today is a special day for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that it is my good friend and colleague Lincoln Davies' birthday today. So happy birthday, Lincoln. The second thing I'm just going to note, I was just absolutely stunned as I was sitting out in the foyer getting ready for these comments, watching the many things that Jan Nystrom has done to make this possible. And for people that don't know, this just wouldn't happen without Jan. It just would not happen without Jan. So thank you, Jan. We're so grateful for you. Okay. So I've been asked to provide an update about where we were as of yesterday, and then maybe give a short glimpse into where we're going today. Here are just some thoughts. The energy transition is not a thing of the future. It's happening. The real question I think that we were exploring yesterday is whether or not it's happening quickly enough, what can happen in order to accelerate the pace, whether or not the hurdles that are standing in front of us are surmountable to accelerate the pace, and a reality that we are confronting this in a context of climate change is also not a thing of the future. Climate change is happening, and that these two strings kind of tug on each other. A little too lax, and we've got more climate change. If we can pull a little bit tighter, we can turn down the volume. And so this becomes a very, very important, the pathway to the future of renewable energy, the renewable energy future is just absolutely critical. And basically, a reflection, we saw many reflections of that yesterday, but one of the reflections was the work of Eric Breitel with the FAST-41 group. And FAST-41, if you weren't here, it's basically a permitting method that allows for permitting at an accelerated rate. It does that through providing additional predictability, providing some additional transparency so that both the public and the project proponent can see where things are at all times, along with increased governmental resources and leadership. One of the things that he highlighted that I think really I would like to underscore is, there are some, when you start thinking about what is the energy transition, my simple mind says, well, what we need is more energy infrastructure. We need more projects. We need more transmission lines. We need more minerals, whatever it is. But a lot of the work that really has been paying off for Fast 41 is the work of leadership, the work of increased reliance on data to make informed decisions earlier, the willingness to try to listen to affected parties earlier, to incorporate more voices, and the need to listen. I'll get back to this in a moment, but one of the things that also became clear, not just in the context of Fast 41, but overall, we are having some challenges of being able to listen well enough. And I think that's got to be a real priority for us. In our second keynote talk, Professor Alex Class, she went on to detail in pretty great detail in a very quick way, very helpful way, where all of the current projects are being cited and where the additional energy infrastructure is being cited, both on the ground currently under construction or newly completed, and also where it's coming in the very, very near future. One of the things that she really tried to highlight, I think, are maybe two different dueling visions of how do we interpret the reality in which we now sit. One of the things that you could take away from her talk was, boy, we've got a lot of work to do. You remember the maps that she put up, and you could see that there were energies, for example, transmission lines. Here's where the new ones are, and maybe it's unprecedented growth, sure, but this is just a small sample of what we're going to need in order to meet the real needs of the energy transition and the real promise of it. She told us that under some measures, if you think about whether it's the nation's climate change goals or critical scientific benchmarks, that we're moving too slowly. I remember hearing maybe 4 or 5 times too slowly. This is a theme that was played out throughout the day, but even as we're making some changes, we see trade-offs. Even with renewable energy, we see trade-offs, and we need to acknowledge those. And we also see that there are a number of places, including in key Western states, and perhaps even the one in which we stand in, where to some extent energy partisanship has gotten in the way of where the market would naturally probably take us. That there has been some resistance among regulated utilities. And we also heard a lot throughout the day about local bans of green energy projects. And that all complicated the way forward. That's one of the things you could have taken from those thoughts, I think. A second kind of pin that we could drop on the map as we figure out where we are, basically asks us to embrace the idea that, granted, time is of the essence, but failure is not an option. And, we are up to this challenge. We could look at the unprecedented investments that are being made, the way that the federal government is leveraging these investments, both through the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and we can see procedural improvements that are being made. Fast 41 is an example of this, and that through hard work we can come together and solve these problems. These problems under this version of the story are not untractable. They're just not solved. I kind of imagine this view as sort of the the NASA war room as the rockets are coming back to Earth, where it's like, well, this isn't possible. We don't have time. Damn it, Jim, just give me a number, right? And there are people that are out there that are really working hard to make sure that happens. Yes, there's some constraints on things like siting, but there's also, people can change. And one of the examples that we saw for that was Texas. It was mentioned throughout the day yesterday how Texas is leading the way, where despite some residual resistance. So, and then there was a thread that I really felt this as I was reading some of the questions yesterday of the audience. A lot of, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze the group, but for me, I felt like a lot of the questions were, can I have hope, or isn't it bad to have hope? I mean, isn't it foolish to have hope? I mean, there's sort of a hopefulness and a cynicalness that ran through a lot of our audience's questions, and I think the same is true of a lot of the topics that we had. It's completely possible to embrace both of these in the exact moment. It's fair to say that both were present yesterday, and but I think Alex asked us to look that there's a reason for excitement. We can actually do this. This is something we can do. And let's have some hope and collectively work to build more. Despair, this comes from a couple of different realities, and one of which is that climate change is not a thing of the future, but it's something that happens. It reflects that many of the emissions that we're worried about are already baked into our atmosphere, emissions of the past. We have infrastructure that isn't necessarily ideal for the challenges that we're confronting. And yes, we heard a number of people say we're not meeting our current scientific milestones, and that there's a lot of evidence that we might not be up for the task. I think hope, to the extent that we find hope, it comes from the fact that we are taking unprecedented steps. We've got this legislation, all relatively new, Inflation Reduction Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, CHIPS, have earmarked literally billions of dollars for very specific challenges that need to be overcome. They've created a powerful magnet that have drawn in massive amounts of capital, and we're seeing action as we speak. And just to kind of highlight that, as we spoke yesterday, here are three things that happened. First of all, the BLM put out some new protections for a species that has been highly impacted by energy development, the greater sage grouse. Proposed management plans that would provide those birds more protection. Second, yesterday, the Department of Energy announced a commitment to Lithium America to provide a $2.26 billion loan to help finance the construction of a lithium carbonate processing plant in our neighboring state, Nevada. And lastly, and we saw so many of the maps where there's so much great potential for wind energy, particularly on the East Coast near our cities, and on our West Coast as well. But those were areas where wind development is really calling out. New York State put into place yesterday and started operating its first wind farm, offshore wind farm. The blades that were stagnant before we started the day are now moving, and this is going to allow New York State to transition 70,000 households from what was dirty energy into clean wind. So, there's a lot of reasons for optimism. And honestly, one of the reasons I felt such optimism, honestly, was the quality of the people that we saw speak yesterday. This isn't a hypothetical, we need leadership, and where are we going to find it? I just think to myself, I cannot believe how brilliant some of these people are. The passion, the dedication. I think that we saw within our symposium yesterday many of the leaders that are already proving to be a vital catalyst for the kinds of changes that we need. And that gives me some hope. One other thing I'm just going to say is one of the most poignant, or a few poignant moments I remember when John Eagle started speaking in Lakota at the very beginning, and you could literally hear a pin drop. Maybe this was the most poignant example of his calling out that, there are some communities that have been left behind in a lot of the discussions, and that there needs to be a better involvement of all communities, and we've got a lot of room to improve. This came up in the last panel as well about thinking about our communities that are sensitive to environmental justice concerns, and that is clearly should be something that we need to listen more and make sure that there are more pathways for more communities to feel the benefit of the energy transition. That seemed to be one of the lessons that I took away as I walked away yesterday. Today, we're going to extend these conversations, and we are going to start here first with a panel on critical minerals. This was a topic that came up a lot during our conversation yesterday. This panel, I'm just going to note, that will be moderated by Alan Eastman. Alan is a PhD and co-founder and inventor of GreenFire Energy, and we appreciate Alan for being moderator on this upcoming panel. I'll allow him to introduce our panelists here in a second. After that, we're going to be talking about federal permitting, a thread that ran through all of our discussions yesterday as well, that this is a real opportunity. Yes, it is often it often is held up as one of the kind of hurdles that need to be cleared, but there's also some real opportunity for permitting reform that will allow for us to move and accelerate the ball more quickly. Hopefully this will not get in the way of thoughtfulness. One of the interactions yesterday was, how often do we allow speed to overcome thoughtfulness? And the answer that was provided was never. But hopefully we can get our thoughtfulness down a little bit more quickly, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that. Then we'll then move to talking about the energy transition here in Utah, and what we're seeing around our own state. And then we will end our day by hearing from our birthday boy, Lincoln Davies, who is going to be talking about our energy future, a keynote address. At any rate, we are so grateful to have you here with us, and we hope you feel warmly welcome. We are just grateful for all of the concern and the work that we have witnessed from people in this room. And at any rate, let's get this one started. So let's get our panel up here.
Well, good morning to everybody. This panel is about one of those nasty little nitty-gritty details that Professor Daniels was talking about. People have been worried about critical minerals for a long time, and I hope this group of really well-qualified, interesting people is going to answer your questions. If you have any questions as we're going along, please take the opportunity to use Sligo and write them out. We have deliberately left a fair amount of time for questions at the end. If you don't come up with questions, I'll have to ask them, and I'm sure yours will better reflect what you're worried about than mine will. So the panel, in more or less in order. Brian E. Richards is a PhD, a senior research scientist at the Energy and Geoscience Institute here at the university. That group is, for example, involved in the geothermal projects down by Milford and is doing a lot of other interesting stuff. And Brian E. will tell you about the fun part of finding where minerals actually live. Rachel Hampton is the lead exploration geologist for Lithium Americas. Lithium Americas is actually the owner and developer of one of the biggest new lithium mines in the world. Steve Feldgus is, the official title is Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary. In Washington, they keep spreading out these titles, so the shorter the title, the more important you are, I guess. And believe me, there are an awful lot that are a lot longer than his. So Steve is interesting because he works in land and minerals management for the Department of the Interior, supervising, among other things, the Bureau of Land Management, so that he is deeply involved in a lot of the subjects of this symposium, including things like permitting. Jamie Pleune is our concluding panelist. She's an associate professor of law here at the College of Law and the interim director of the Law and Policy Program at the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment. So I guess we have to include the lawyers, don't we? At any rate, if we could have the first slide, I want to give just a little introduction of what we're talking about in terms of critical minerals, why they're important, and people talk about critical minerals all the time, but it's probably important to see, to see what is really a critical material in the way they're defined officially. So officially, a critical material is anything that's not a fuel, but it can be an element or substance or any material that has a high risk of supply chain disruption and serves an essential function in one or more energy technologies. So that's what it's defined as. You'll often hear people talk about critical minerals. Well, the definition of a critical mineral is basically anything that's a critical material. So you have oddball things that are called critical minerals, even though to a geologist they aren't minerals. But as long as somebody says the magic words critical and they're in danger of supply chain, then they are a critical material. Okay, just a minute. Got to get this going the right direction. Okay. Okay. Now, the United States Geological Survey was kind enough to make a list of what they consider critical minerals. That's a pretty big list, and I'm not going to discuss each of them in turn, but what you really need to know is that there are a lot of materials whose supply is dubious, who might be in danger of being in shortage because they're somewhere in the supply chain that can be interrupted. But let's talk a little bit more about the actual uses for critical materials. We have here things like rechargeable batteries on top. The minerals that you'll see used in batteries are things like lithium, cobalt, nickel. Why is carbon listed? Because it turns out that graphite makes a great cathode for batteries. We have things like electric vehicle motors. Why all those little tiny elements you've never heard of? Because one big component of an electrical motor is high intensity magnets. And all of those rare earth metals help make the magnets stronger and of higher intensity. Same thing for the next layer down, which is wind turbines. Zinc is the biggest metal that you've heard of that's used. Most people have never heard of terbium or samarium or neodymium or praseodymium, yet they are all important in making the strong magnets that both motors and generators depend on. And finally, once you make the power, you've got to get it somewhere, which is why aluminum and copper are included. Now, I'm not going to take time to go through all of the renewable portfolio standards, but basically a renewable portfolio standard, just to remind you, is a requirement that's set out by a state to change the way that they either use or create energy. Those in the dark green have fiats, essentially, for what you need to do. For example, California wants 50% of its cars to be electric cars by the year 2030. Other states have similar standards. The ones in light green have told people what they want to do, but it's just a suggestion. Utah is one of those. Suggestions and business being what they are, it's unlikely that they're going to push very hard. And the gray states have no renewable portfolio standards. Nevertheless, the bulk of the United States population has a renewable portfolio standard they're supposed to meet, which means that you have more clean energy demands that you have to deal with. Look at the right side graph over there. If we're to meet the renewable portfolio requirements by 2020, we'd have to have 42 times as much lithium as we do produce now. We would have to have 25 times as much graphite, about 20 times as much cobalt and nickel, and 7 times as much rare earth elements as we produce. This is a problem. How do you get those critical minerals? Well, first you find a source. You explore for them. You get the mineral out of the source. That's mining. And then you have processing, which consists of concentrating what you want, isolate your target from the matrix it's in, from its rock or its ore or brine in the case of a lot of lithium. You purify it and you put it in usable form. So these are 3 or 4 quite different processes that have to be gone through. And so you have sometimes the people who take the material out of the ore, or mine the material, don't do the processing. On the left side of here, you have countries that are responsible for extracting different ores. On the right side, you have countries that do the processing. Note in the red, those big red bars on the right side, China does a significant proportion of all of the processing. I don't want to talk politics, but there are going to be politics involved in getting some of these critical minerals simply because the United States and China are rivals in international business. So what we can do about that is one of the questions that needs to be answered that Professor Daniels noted. And finally, time is critical. The average time it takes worldwide to get a material from discovery to production is on the order of 20 years. If we have a renewable portfolio requirement that needs to be met in 2030, we don't have 20 years to do that. So what this panel of really good people is going to talk about is how we do that. They're going to talk about the different parts of it, how we get there, and hopefully answer some of the questions, but some of the questions are not going to be answered because we just don't have them yet. But we're off to a good start, as Greg pointed out. Okay, our first speaker will be Bryony Richards. So, Bryony,
awesome.
all yours. There's the clicker.
Good morning, everybody. I am going to talk about the upfront cost of critical elements, critical minerals, critical materials, whatever you want to call them. My first slide, when it appears. There we go. Why am I qualified to talk about this? Well, I'm a geologist, and I've spent a lot of time in different parts of the world looking for minerals. Everything from looking for the very start of minerals. Can we see the expression of minerals on the surface? Is that enough to make a mine? And what minerals are we looking for? When we find one of these minerals, it's not as simple as just finding it in the ground. The upfront costs of mining are horrendous, as most of you know, and critical minerals doesn't escape that. And the difficult thing about this is that we have this beautiful green revolution that's going on. And it's great after the mining, but mining itself is a dirty, disruptive, just terrible process on the earth. We've got to find ways of getting round mining to make it a little better. We're going to have to accept that the upfront cost of green technology is going to be awful. But how can we minimize that? So from having traveled, lived, studied, and worked on 6 continents, I'm just missing Antarctica right now, and don't intend to go there, I think I've learned a little bit about this. And I've worked with a lot of companies. Some are great, some are terrible. And it's about weeding through those to find the kind of good players in this. So one of the ways that we can look at critical minerals is that a lot of the Western US, as you can see in this slide, has a huge legacy of metal mining. These are just metal mines. So nickel, copper, silver, gold, and these go back to the 1800s. How many people ski in Utah? Yeah, hands up, high school students, I'm sure you do. Brighton, Outer, Solitude. Have you looked around and seen the tailings piles? Next time you ski, look at the mountains. There are little triangular piles of dirt all over the mountains. Those go back to the 1800s, silver mining, gold mining. That's our legacy in Utah. And not just Utah, the Western United States. So in the Western United States, actually across the US, we have over 64,000 inactive mine sites. And that's everything from the tiny mom and pop gold operations that you see on Discovery Gold Rush to the massive multinational corporations like Bingham Canyon that you see in Utah. But the evidence is everywhere. It's on our BLM land, it's on our forestry land, it's on our ski areas. And those tailings piles, we often don't even know what's in them. We know that a lot of them have really nasty stuff in. Mercury, cadmium, all the terrible things that do awful things to people, yet we have let them sit on our landscape. So what can we do about this? Well, a lot of companies don't want to touch these tailings piles because of what they contain, and that's fair enough. But can we make it an incentive to look at them? Is there an economic incentive to reprocessing these tailings? If we look at the really terrible metals and minerals in there, mercury, arsenic, lead, cadmium, there's got to be a good way of making an economic incentive to be able to reclamate that land, to get those horrible things out of the ground. The tailings themselves can have other effects. They're fairly easily mobilized with wind. So as you drive along I-80 and you drive past the massive tailings piles at Kennecott, you'll see them spraying water. And that's because the dust is very easily blown off. Tailings are very fine by nature. And when I say fine, if you were to put them in your mouth, which I do not recommend doing, you wouldn't be able to bite grains. It would be so fine, it would be almost like talcum powder. So you can imagine when the wind blows, these tailings go a long way. They're going to influence our crops, agriculture, surface runoff, even our air quality. If you see the map on the right-hand side here, you can see where our legacy of tailings are. These are our historic mine sites, our inactive tailing sites, and they're often in areas like Moab where we recreate. So this green energy transition isn't just about finding things, it's cleaning up our past at the same time. And how can we make that past work towards this green technology transition with us? I'm going to leave this up for everybody to read. The idea of reprocessing tailings is both environmental restoration, waste reduction, and also economic incentivization for companies. It's got to be good for them to mine it, because if a company touches those tailings piles, they're responsible for them. They're not just responsible for mining them, but they're responsible for the reclamation of them after they've finished. And that is a huge problem, because the EPA will have certain standards. You can't just mine something and leave it. You've got to leave it in a better state. And right now, there aren't many policies related to that, and Jamie will talk about that later. What can we get out of tailings? Well, when we've had things like lithium mines, obviously we can get lithium out. Cobalt mines, what else do cobalt mines have in them? They have a lot of different things, including rare earth elements sometimes. Not only do we have the original mineable element, but the tailings often have things that they weren't looking for in the 1800s. Can we now look at those and work out what's profitable? So I wanted to put up a pretty picture, because it's not all terrible. This is Spore Mountain. This is in central Utah. Spore Mountain is a great way of assessing tailings. It's had an active mining history from 1968 onwards. And actually, the view that you can see right now is littered with tailings under that mountain. Uranium tailings, fluorspar tailings, and beryllium tailings, all of which are useful. So this is my little study area, those mountains that you can see in the background. And these areas are gorgeous. And I wanted to remind everybody of that we have this rich legacy of mining in gorgeous, beautiful places. So we need to work out how to keep that. One of the ways to do that I use is hyperspectral imaging. And it's one of these topics that's really fantastic. We're doing a lot of research on how we can use data from satellites to look at these tailings from the surface and actually assess their chemical values. So this is what I do. I do hyperspectral imaging and ground characterization. And with that, I can make a new type of map. And these new types of maps show where our critical elements, critical minerals, and critical materials are. And they also, just like our lands, are really, really pretty. And the only thing I wanted to show on this map is how obvious our tailings are. You can see in the top left of the image, there's a big pink mountain. That's Spore Mountain that you saw in that photo. Can you see the blue pieces underneath it on the slopes? Those are the tailings. From the photo, we couldn't see them, but they are incredibly extensive. So I just want to leave everybody with, one, a nice photo, but also one that shows what we need to clean up. So, thank you.
That was wonderful, Bryony. We'll have some questions for you as we go along, I'm sure. Our next speaker is Rachel. Rachel, and we'll talk about lithium, I suspect.
Yes, indeed. That is exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. Excellent. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me here today. This is a bit of a different kind of conference that I'm used to going to because I'm a rock person. I generally spend my days thinking about rock, not environmental policy, but I hope today I can kind of marry the two by talking about how we actually get these critical minerals out of the ground in new mining projects. And I'm going to do that by talking about an example of one of these projects that's coming online today, which is the Thacker Pass lithium deposit in northern Nevada. All right, so I do work for a publicly traded company, so I do have to put this up there. We're moving on. So, all right, I do want to see a show of hands right now. Who has a smartphone, drives an electric vehicle? Keep your hands up. Has ever ridden on an airplane? Has handheld power tools at their house? Right, exactly. So that's pretty much everybody in this room already uses lithium drastically in your daily lives. So that's something that's already important, but as we use these technologies more and more and more, we're going to need more of these materials. And as we kind of mentioned, it's not easy to bring these online. So we're forecasted to have a bit of a gap in terms of how much lithium we want and how much we actually need or can get. And so that's our job as geologists, as industry folks, as environmental policy people, is to think about this problem and how we can solve this in the most responsible way possible. So lithium, it turns out, can be found almost everywhere on this planet, but it's a little bit different than most of the commodities we think of in mining. So for instance, with gold or silver, you can walk around on the surface of the earth and actually find nuggets of pure gold, right? But lithium doesn't form like that. It's very reactive, so lithium does not form as a pure metal on the surface of the earth. So what it actually does is it gets stuffed into other rocks. So it sort of hides itself in these other rocks. And most of our mining history with lithium has been getting lithium out of these very hard, very big crystals. And that's what all those red dots are. Those are those resources. That's the most environmentally disruptive way to mine lithium. So we've actually explored other ways of mining lithium. And one of those ways is through brine deposits. So lithium can be actually dissolved in aquifers that have salt in them and other kind of stuff that aren't potable, but we can pull those out of the ground and actually concentrate the lithium using just the energy of the sun. So that's a really great way to mine lithium. But here in the US, we can't really do that. We don't have the space or the sunlight to actually accomplish that. So how are we going to get a domestic supply of lithium to solve some of those political issues, to solve some of our supply chain issues, and make sure that we can make the energy transition that we've been talking about in terms of battery technology and all of our renewable technologies? So here in the US, what we actually have is lithium that mostly gets into sediments. So think of clay, think of mud, sand, those kinds of rocks. That's where the lithium is hiding here in the US. And I'm going to talk about Thacker Pass in particular, because this is one of the largest, if not the largest, deposit of lithium on the planet, and it happens to be right here in our backyard. So Thacker Pass is owned by Lithium Americas, which is the company that I work for, but the project is located right on the Oregon-Nevada border, just south of that border, north of Winnemucca, if you've ever driven across I-80. It's on BLM land, so we've worked with the BLM to get our permits and all that good stuff. This will be the first lithium project to come online in almost 50 years since the Silver Peak mine was built in southern Nevada. So this is really an exciting step for the US because we haven't had a domestic supply of lithium pretty much in a long time, in decades. And this is a huge resource. So the Thacker Pass deposit itself has over 16 million tons of what we call lithium carbonate equivalent. And lithium carbonate is the good stuff that goes into batteries, right? So we can't just put lithium metal in, we actually put lithium attached to something else, and usually that's carbonate. So that's what goes into the batteries. But the exciting thing is that this area actually has a lot of advantages that allow us to be really responsible and minimize our environmental impact as we get this huge resource out. And in addition to that, I did want to point out the exciting news yesterday that we've already heard a little bit about, but we did get a conditional DOE loan funding yesterday for about $2.2 billion, which is the largest investment that has ever been made in a project by the DOE. So this is really exciting. This project is happening, and this is going to be a big deal for the US supply chain. So now I want to talk about all the pieces that actually go into making a mining project happen like this. So the first part, before we even look at the rocks in the ground, before we even get into how we're going to get it out of the ground, we have to talk to the community. This is something that was brought up yesterday as a critical piece, but we as a company believe that this is our essential duty to be the best neighbors that we can. So that starts with consultation with the community and trying to make sure that it's a win-win for everyone. So that has included making a community benefits agreement with the local Paiute and Shoshone tribe at the Fort McDermott area. And this is something that's actually part of the system in Canada, but is not required here in the US. But we believe that this is something that should happen with all mining projects, that we should make community benefits agreements to make sure that everybody is getting something out of this. So this is going to include the building of a new cultural center to preserve artifacts, to preserve local seed banks and that kind of thing. We're also helping with roads, new schools, funding new jobs, making sure that the community is winning on this, and making sure that we involve the community in this project. So the people running the project are the community members, and that means that they're going to be the most responsible because that is their home and they want to take care of it. And so that's really an important part of what we have done, is to hire locally. So once we start talking to the community, then we can start thinking about the rocks, and that's a little bit of bias. That's what I do. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of this deposit and what makes it so special. I know most of us aren't geologists, but I hope this is kind of an interesting introduction into how these deposits form. So the Thacker Pass deposit really starts with the history of the Yellowstone volcano, which we know today in Yellowstone National Park. But its history in the US actually started on the Oregon-Nevada border area, and it's moved over time. So about 16 million years ago, we had a very special eruption right here on the border. And this eruption was special because it actually was highly concentrated in lithium. So that actual magma had lithium in it. And as it erupted, that lithium was brought to the surface. But this wasn't just any eruption. This was massive. So think of Mount St. Helens. That's something that we as humans have experienced. You might have seen videos of it. Catastrophic, right? This is 1,000 times bigger in terms of volume and explosivity. So this is massive. And when you do that, what you do is you leave a big hole behind after you erupt all that material. So think of Crater Lake National Park, where you've exploded a volcano, left a bowl, and filled it up with a lake. That's what happened here, and that's what allowed us to actually get lithium sediments in that lake that were sort of absorbing that lithium like a sponge. So just to show that schematically, so we have our lithium-enriched magma. It comes to the surface. We're able to put that into a bowl, or what we call a lacustrine system, a big, nice lake. And then we have sediments that actually absorb that lithium and take it into their structure. Hydrothermal fluids can also help to enrich these deposits. And then we can come along with our trucks and get this right off the surface. So that's sort of a bit about where this deposit came from, how these rocks got there, but now how do we get them out of the ground responsibly? So the really exciting thing is that these are just clays, mud, sitting almost at the surface. So our pit is going to be very shallow, our footprint is going to be very small relative to other mining operations, and we don't really have to use much blasting, if any. And so that's really going to minimize the environmental impact that we have on this area. And then the other thing that we're going to do that's really important is called active reclamation. It's something that the coal mining industry really sort of pioneered, if you will, but we're going to sort of take that on, and what you do is you start digging your hole, and then as you dig your hole, you fill it back in as you go. And as you fill it back in, you immediately start revegetating it. So that means that by the time you're done digging your pit, most of the pit is already revegetated and has started that process of getting back to where it was. So that's a really important part of our process. The second part of this is actually getting the lithium into a usable form, right? So we can't just put mud into a battery and call it good, right? We actually have to get that lithium out and clean it up. So what we've done is we've actually done this in a laboratory in Reno. No one on the planet has ever gotten lithium out of a sedimentary deposit, so we had to prove that this was possible and do the engineering behind it. So what we have here is a full-scale replica of our processing facility so that we can do this at scale, make tons of lithium, and really make sure we understand what's going on. So just to go through that a little bit, because it's a new process. So what we do is we take the clay out of the ground, just scoop it up with a bulldozer. Then we actually turn it into what is sort of like a milkshake type consistency of a slurry. Then we need to get the calcium out. So we put it through what's called an acid leaching step, which sounds really scary, but all we're doing is taking solid state sulfur, which is very inert, and we're making it into sulfuric acid on site, which is an exothermic reaction and then gives power back to the whole process. And then we're able to use that sulfuric acid, get rid of the calcium, and then immediately neutralize it. So it doesn't go into our tailings, it doesn't do anything, it just immediately stays in that laboratory setting. Then we have to get out the magnesium, and so we do that by crystallizing Epsom salts, which we all know of as something you can take a bath with, so a very safe substance to work with as a byproduct. And then we get all the sodium and potassium, and we're left with an enriched lithium liquid that we can turn into battery quality lithium carbonate. And the reason I say battery quality is because that really changes by the battery manufacturer. So you, as a lithium producer, are really a specialty chemical company in making a very specific composition of lithium carbonate for a specific battery manufacturer. So this lithium carbonate can't just go to anyone. It has to go to a very specified battery making facility. And all of our lithium is going to go to GM for the first 10 years for their electric vehicle manufacturing. So this is how we turn our mud into lithium carbonate, which is the useful stuff. And then the last part of this, of course, is reclamation. And as I mentioned, this is also the first step. So thinking about how we can do the best job of this, planning it out, thinking it through, and then doing this, carrying it out at the end of the process. And so we take this very seriously, and we have a very detailed plan about how we're going to do this and actively do it right from the start. So we have a native seed mix that we're going to be revegetating with. We have plans to stabilize the slopes and make sure that the topography looks very similar to what it does today. And then at the end of the mine life, whenever that is, we're going to take it all out of there and make it look like nothing was ever there. And so I hope that what I've convinced you about today is that, one, we're going to need a lot of this material, so mining is inevitable. but that responsible mining is not an oxymoron. This is something that we can do if we focus on all of these different pieces of the puzzle. So that includes our community, using our resources really wisely, making sure that we're following all of our rules, getting our permits, and using the diverse workforce that exists here in the US to have the most ideas and drive this process forward. So I look forward to taking your questions about this, but I hope that I've convinced you that it's possible.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I don't know about the people sitting out there, but I learned a lot in your presentation. Our next presenter is Steve Feldgus, and Steve is is a key part here because he is where regulation and the real political world hits technology. So, Steve, I'm not going to bother trying to explain better than that what you do, but all yours.
Sure thing. I'm not either. It's fairly complex, kind of like my title. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually a little bit broader than critical minerals, because I'm going to describe the findings from the Interagency Working Group on Mining Laws, Regulations, and Policy, which put out a report last September, which you can get with this QR code right here. And we put in there, well, what we did was study the U.S. mining system. And for those of you who don't know what the U.S. mining system is like, it's very antiquated, especially on federal lands, particularly on federal lands. And most of the time when I speak to audiences about the mining law of 1872, no one has ever heard of it. And I will say this is one of the most intimidating audiences to speak out the mining law in front of. There are some of the absolute world experts on the mining law in here who have, taught at this university, so it's really kind of an honor to be here, and as I said, a little bit scary. So I'll try not to get anything wrong. So our report, and actually our interagency working group, came out of the supply chain executive order that President Biden signed back in February 2021, and after an initial 100-day period, a working group came back and said, we should really do an interagency group that looks at America's mining laws and permitting processes and how we make them better. Primarily for critical minerals, but also for everything that we do. Most of the mining in the U.S. is gold and copper, which are not on the USGS critical mineral list, but we want to improve that as well. So, cutting right to the chase, after quite a bit of engagement, a lot of meetings with various stakeholder groups, with tribes, with the industry, with law professors, with states, we put together a report that had 65 total recommendations in there, and 30 of them were pointed towards Congress, mostly around trying to reform the mining law of 1872. It's a 150-year-old law. We can't do anything about it ourselves in the executive branch. We need Congress to update that. Then about 18 recommendations that are directed to regulatory agencies for new regulations, and then 33 recommendations for policy and process. So things that we can do ourselves. And doesn't quite add up to 65, but that's because a lot of these overlap. There are a lot of things where we said, well, we can do this part of the way, but we really need a regulation or a law to improve. If anyone followed, I doubt anyone saw the press when this came out last September, but the National Mining Association came out and immediately said there is nothing in this report that will help with mining in the United States whatsoever. They were very not pleased with it. They testified before Congress to the same exact thing. They said, no, this is absolutely terrible. This takes us backwards, doesn't have anything good at all. And then when they're talking to each other at industry conferences, like at the Idaho Mining Association last year, they'll admit this. They actually liked about a third of them. So 21 recommendations, favorable or benign, which I guess is good. 21 they didn't like, and 22 they are still evaluating. Most of the ones they didn't like had to do with reform of the mining law of 1872. For those of you who don't know the mining law of 1872, and I imagine there are some people here who don't, imagine if you still had the Homestead Act out there, and you just go out and start farming on a plot of public land, and then it becomes yours. Or if we were still giving away land grants to railroads, you can go build a railroad and get the checkerboard pattern on either side of the railroad. That's what the mining law is basically about. It comes from that same period of laws and is about incentivizing people to develop the West, to come out, to stake claims, and then if you find any valuable minerals on that claim, those are yours for free, and you can actually buy the land for about $3 an acre. And that's why most of our large Western mines are on private land, is because they date back to when we still allowed people to buy the land. So they would buy all the claims around their mine, so you have these little islands of private land in the sea of public land. Congress shut off that ability to buy the land for cheap about 30 years ago, but everything else remains the same. So unlike oil, gas, and coal, where there's a leasing system, for hard rock mining, it's free access and claims. So anywhere that we haven't withdrawn, you can just go out there and stake a claim, and then you have the right to explore for minerals on that claim. And if you find anything, you have the right to develop those. And that sort of exists outside of all of our other land use processes. It's not a leasing system. There are no royalties. That's just an example of some of the problems we have with that law. So our recommendations in this report to do some major overhauls of that law were not viewed favorably by the industry. So just to give you a sense of some of the three big overarching findings of the report, the first one I've already mentioned, is that we really believe we need to overhaul the mining law of 1872. Another thing is the real weakness in our system is in community and tribal engagement. And along with the mining law of 1872, there's a lot of controversy about mining regulations in the U.S. And do we have a good system? Because, you know, we probably have the oldest mining law in the world, and a lot of people equate that to mean we have very poor regulations or systems of overseeing mines. The industry would argue, no, we have some of the toughest environmental regulations in the world. We are the gold standard. And from our report, from our work, what we could find is the industry seems to be more correct. We can't make a blanket statement saying we have the best regulations in the world. We need to do more comparison about that. But certainly we have among the best regulatory or environmental regulations and financial assurance regulations. So the money you have to put up front to make sure that you do the reclamation of that mine when you're done, so you don't end up with 1 million tailings piles left after you're done, which used to be the way that you could operate in the U.S. When you were done, you just picked up and left. So those regulations in the U.S., really good, okay, among the best in the world. However, when it comes to community and tribal engagement around mining, we are well behind most other nations. Certainly the other like Western nations we would think of as peers, like Australia and Canada and Chile. But there are a lot of countries that have much stronger requirement for engaging with communities and tribes beforehand. Our system is really bad at this. And some of it is part of the way the mining law works. There's no leasing. So you go out, you just stake a claim, you don't really have to tell anyone. No one in the community knows, unless they're following along a BLM database really closely, that there's a new mining claim there. And then, if you want to do some initial exploration, even up to drilling wells, as long as you're disturbing less than 5 acres, there's no NEPA, there's no Endangered Species Act consultation, there's no Historic Preservation Act work, right? It's not even a matter of a categorical exclusion within NEPA. There is just no NEPA. It does not qualify. It's not a federal action. So you can have people drilling wells before anyone in a community knows what is going on, and that can drive a lot of, well, surprise, first of all, but also conflict. And people feel blindsided. And then it's generally typical of the industry to exaggerate a little bit about what they're finding. So, sorry, no offense. You guys, you have something for real. But there's certainly a lot of junior exploration companies, they're trying to raise money. So they'll drill a couple holes and they'll go out and brag, we think we've found the largest deposit of whatever in the known universe. And this will scare people nearby because there has been no public engagement through that point. Only when they do a more extensive exploration plan or propose an actual mining operation will the public get engaged. So it's very late in the process, and we think it needs to be a lot earlier. And then the third thing here is that the permitting process can be improved through proven methods. So this is kind of bleeding into the next panel's discussion, which I'm very excited to hear about. But yeah, the federal permitting process certainly has some issues with it. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to talk about. But it's not quite as bad as people think, and we have some ways that we can do it a lot better, and we've shown that we can. Before I get too detailed into that, I just want to show something off. All right, so this is permit timing. okay? What you hear all the time is that permitting a mine in the United States takes 7 to 10 years. I mean, it's so well known that when people were writing comments to us, they didn't even bother to reference that statement. They're like, oh yeah, it takes 7 to 10 years. We all know that. I mean, that's kindergarten stuff. And for those few people who actually did reference it, they referenced this 2015 report from SNL Metals and Mining. And sure enough, in that report, it said it averaged 7 to 10 years in the US to permit operations, whereas in Canada and Australia, it took about 2 years. Okay. These are things we hear all the time, and we were very excited to find the report and actually dig through the data, so to speak, and find out, okay, what is it that takes 7 to 10 years, and how do we shrink that process? How do we make that quicker as permitting agencies? Well, if you go to the report and you actually read the fine print, what you'll see is that they didn't actually collect any data to make this statement. They received it from the National Mining Association and put it in the report and said, we assume this is true. So it's a great example of whatever you want to think it is. So the fact is, we don't have any data that shows it takes 7 to 10 years to permit a mine in the US. You can certainly find individual mines that take an incredibly long time. There are always outliers. There's outliers in almost everything that we do. However, well, first of all, before I get to the average, let me just say the Canadians don't think it takes 2 to 3 years to permit a mine either. They claim 10 to 15 years. All right. And actually, recently, I think I saw one of their ministers say it takes 15 to 20 years to permit a mine. So by that standard, it seems like we're doing extremely well. And as these slides show, which you've already seen, it takes a really long time to develop a mine in the world. It takes 15 to 20 years on average to go from initial exploration to development. So again, if we are taking 7 to 10 years, that's fantastic. All right. Several problems, of course. First of all, the data for 7 to 10 years isn't really there. And second of all, what's your starting point and what's your ending point? All right. When we hear 7 to 10 years, are we talking about the NEPA process? Are we talking about when a company actually puts together a mine plan to when they start producing? It's not very clear, and no one ever makes it clear. When we look at the numbers that we have, all right, from the Bureau of Land Management, and look at how they permit, we looked at 147 mines over the past 10 years. And a lot of numbers up here, but you really should focus on the two that I highlighted, which are the plans requiring environmental impact statements. Those are the ones that are the larger mines. The ones that just require EAs are generally smaller mines or maybe mine modifications. But the larger mines take, on average, just a little over 3 years to get through NEPA, and about 4.5 years to go through the entire BLM process. So that goes from the first time BLM finds out about the mine to when that company has filed their financial assurance and can begin operating. So again, 7 to 10 years, that's much longer than this. Now, we can do better than this, all right? Under the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we need to get our NEPA timelines down to 2 years for an EIS. And we believe that we can get there because there are a lot of places, such as in Nevada, where we can do EISs in basically 1 year. And the key to that is early engagement, early, frequent, intensive engagement, not just with the applicant, but also with all levels of government and different types of government. So bringing together different federal agencies, along with the state, along with the tribes, along with local governments, and figuring out beforehand what the issues are going to be, where the conflicts are, and then what information the company is going to need to get through the NEPA process. And when you do that early work, which is not required, but it is a best practice, when you do that early work, your EISs can take a year and a half. All right. We have permitted a number of mines, including a critical mineral one recently in Nevada, the Gibellini Vanadium mine. That took a couple of years. It got no controversy because there was good, early engagement with local communities and with the tribes, and no one really heard about it. Right? You hear about the mines that take 10, 20 years or longer. You don't hear about the mines that move through very smoothly, and in a way, that's sort of our hope. You shouldn't hear about all these mines because there should be a process that goes well, but at the same time, it sort of gives people a mistaken impression about the federal permitting process and how long it takes. And so with that, that is the end of my presentation, and I'll be looking forward to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. You've given everybody a lot of hope. Okay, our next and final panel member is Jamie Pleune, who will talk about whatever she's going to talk about.
Okay, I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about what we're trying to achieve when we're permitting a mine and thinking about how we can do it better. I will say I come from, first of all, it is like the best thing in the world to be on a panel and have my thunder stolen by this whole story that permitting is actually happening a lot faster than what people are talking about. And I'll be on the next panel and talk more about that. But it's a first, and I'm thrilled. But I will say, when we talk about permitting, there's a tendency to say, oh, these long permitting times, we should loosen permitting standards in order to speed up. And yesterday, Freddie, when he was posed with the question of, at what point do we prioritize speed over thoughtfulness, his answer was never. And I agree with that, and I also think it's not necessarily a one-to-one trade-off. Moreover, the thought that we should just skip over thoughtfulness in pursuit of speed is what is referred to as a maladaptive response. So this is the IPCC report, which is kind of the gold star report on climate change, and it acknowledges that we feel intense urgency to respond to climate change. And there's a sense that we just want to, reduce greenhouse gas emissions at all costs, and that becomes the pole star that you're looking for. And so you take short-term actions that actually have long-term effects that can worsen existing inequalities, natural conditions that are being threatened by climate change, and overall worsen or exacerbate some of the biggest threats that climate change pose to us. So when we think about how we're going to respond, we have to be very careful that the responses that we take are ones that are not maladaptive, but instead that are going to move us forward towards a better, more resilient world and avoid the worst consequences of climate change. So there are 4 reasons that I believe that we should not loosen regulatory standards in pursuit of speed. Biodiversity and ecosystem services are top of mind for me, as well as safety, justice, and finally, it's not necessary. So I'm going to talk about biodiversity and ecosystem services first. We are facing a twin crisis when we talk about climate change. We all hear about climate change all the time. We hear about the biodiversity crisis a little bit less. A report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which you don't hear about as much as the IPCC, but you can think of it as an equivalent intergovernmental body of collected scientists that are the smartest and best in the world, who thought very deeply about these problems. And what they've found is that human beings have severely altered 75% of the Earth's surface and 66% of the marine environment, degrading ecosystem services and accelerating extinctions. Biodiversity is declining faster than it ever has at any other time in history. Monitored populations of vertebrates have declined by 68% in the last 5 years. Half of the world's wild population, or wild animals, have been lost over the last 40 years, and 30% of all wild plants are threatened with extinction. And it's not just charismatic fauna. This graph shows the different categories of insects and the rate at which they are either vulnerable, endangered, or extinct. So a massive decline. And that initially doesn't seem that scary because none of us like mosquitoes. But really what we're talking about are the animals that are the animals, insects, that they provide pollination. They help decompose things. They provide the network underground that helps roots grow. These are the workers of the ecosystem services that we rely on for civilized society. Oops. It does not want to show that slide. So what are the 5 drivers to this loss in biodiversity? land use change, pollution, natural resource exploitation, climate change, and invasive species. And I'm sorry to say this, but mining contributes to all 5 of those drivers. So just to give you a perspective, it typically requires moving hundreds of tons of ore just to produce 1 ton of copper. If we look at statistics from 1997, with a 0.6% grade ore, it was estimated that it was necessary to move 573 tons of material per ton produced. And importantly, the grade of ore that we're able to mine is getting worse and worse, which means that you have to move more and more earth in order to get the same amount of material. So let's talk about safety, which is my next reason that we should not be loosening regulatory standards. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this one point. When we talk about biodiversity, it's easy to think that this is an academic concept. And I think it's also easy to think like, okay, well, we talked about pronghorn antelopes yesterday. Well, what if we just don't have as many pronghorn antelopes? The problem with is that we don't understand exactly how all the natural systems interact and the consequence of losing some of them. But what we do understand is that the natural systems, as they work together, are what provide the functionality of so many things that we rely on in our daily lives. 50% of the world's GDP is directly is directly reliant on services that we get from the natural world. And it's not showing part of the slide that's supposed to be there, but this is an image that just specifies some of those services that we get. Like I said, we're talking about pollination, construction materials. So now we can go on to safety. That's why I lost it. When we think about mining, it is a very long process, and it's an extensive process, and it's also an inherently dangerous process. So if you really think about it, mining is basically digging a hole. And in essence, it's a competition with gravity. There is a direct relationship between the amount of material that's mined and the complexities of extracting, transporting, and transforming naturally occurring rocks into mineral commodities. So massive amounts of earth must be moved, crushed, and refined to obtain material. And as I said, it takes essentially hundreds of tons in order to get 1 ton of copper, and then with different materials, there are different percentages that can be achieved or obtained from, depending on the grade or depending on the type of material that the mineral is being mined from. Within this process, accidents happen. And so if we think about the risk of accidents in the future, one way to understand that is to look at the past pattern of accidents. So this is a graph from a study that was looked at historical rates of accidents or breaches at mine tailings dams. And it looked at the data from the past 100 years, so 1950 to 2020. And this graph right here is divided by decade, so that, as you can see, as we get closer to the present, there are an increased rate of accidents. And that's a direct correlation to the increased rate of production. And some of these accidents were small, but some of them were quite dramatic. And they're not all in the late past. So in January 2019, there was a catastrophic failure of a tailings dam in Brazil, releasing 9.7 million cubic meters of tailings that went 8 kilometers and killed over 272 people. In 2015, the San Marco mine in Brazil killed 19 people, sending tailings nearly 700 kilometers down the Rio Doce to the Atlantic. And in 2014, the Mount Poly gold and copper mine in British Columbia failed, releasing 35 million cubic meters of mine tailings and waste into Quinnell Lake. And these all did not happen in foreign countries. In 2015, we had an accident at the Gold King mine in San Juan County, Colorado, that released 3 million gallons of acid mine drainage containing an estimated 540 tons of heavy metals. So this is a graph from that study that divided the rate of accidents by country and region. And you'll notice that, and then it also divided the time period. So light blue is pre-2000 and dark blue is 2000 to the present. And so obviously there's a bit of a higher rate of accident in before, lower rates of accidents 2000s to the present, but they are not, we still have accidents. And one thing that I think is fascinating is you see on the far right, there's one country that stands out from all the others with the highest rate of accidents, and that's the United States. And what I'd suggest to you is that it's not that we have a disproportionate amount of more accidents, but that we have a better reporting system. And so if you think about that, that makes you realize that this graph is underrepresenting the rate of accidents that occur in other countries and all over the world. So this study concluded that over the last 100 years, the average rate of accidents is about 3 per year. Perhaps if we had better data, we would find that it was more. There was another study that looked at financial disclosures to understand tailings risks, and I won't go into all the details, but it was really interesting because one of the things about tailings dams is that we don't know very much about them. However, with this increased oversight from financial institutions who want to avoid risk, there's more and more data that's becoming available. So this study took disclosures that were demanded by different financial industries and then used that to back itself into trying to understand internationally the global distribution of mine tailings. So what it found was about 30% of the economic sector reported, and then from that it kind of backed into how many tailings dams there are. Importantly, 10% of all the dams had reported stability concerns. So the final thing that I'll say of why we should not loosen regulatory standards is justice. We have over 160,000 identified abandoned hard rock mines on federal lands, and those are only the ones that are identified. And those are not evenly distributed. Those are often closer to lower economic communities and very often in close proximity to tribal lands. So if we think about a lax regulatory regime, it creates an inconsistent playing field with backwards incentives. It makes it more profitable for a company to operate not adhering to strict regulatory standards. And if we think about a strong regulatory environment, it evens the playing field, and it takes all of those costs and it forces companies equally to internalize the cost of being a good operator, of actually reclaiming their land, their mining operations, of adhering to high safety standards, as Lithium Americas is doing. And it evens the playing field by distributing those costs or forcing all companies to internalize those costs, not just companies that choose to. And as we'll go into later, it is possible, and I believe that we have demonstrated that designing regulatory strategies to deliver value can also produce timely results. So with that, I'll...
Thank you very much, Jamie. I think the message here is of cautious optimism. Yes, there are things that we can do. We can be optimistic, as Brigham pointed out at the beginning of the session. We are optimistic, but we're also being realistic, and that there are things that we can do better and should do better. I have gotten a lot of really interesting questions, and we have about half an hour to talk about them. So let's start with Brian and tailings.
Okay.
There, And basically, what's the state of technology to repurpose some of those materials that you find out of tailings, and how much material overall do you think is reclaimable from tailings?
Simple answer, we don't know, because there's not a lot of funding actually to look at these reclaimed tailings or tailings that need to be reclaimed. Having said that, the work that I've done shows it is profitable to reprocess some of these finds, and we're looking at technology now how to do that. After the grants have come out from the Biden-Harris administration, the bipartisan grants, there's been a lot more of an avenue to do this work. And so we are sort of starting to look at the different reprocessing methods. There are a couple of big projects coming up in the next couple of years, and that will give us a lot more insight into how to do that. The first steps, however, are to even know where the tailings are. We don't have a state inventory of tailings right now. We have no idea where they are. We can find the big ones. That's easy. Like if you drive down I-80, you see the tailings from Kennecott. However, there are really discrete tailings which have had a lot of regrowth on them. Some plants actually really like tailings, and so you'll find really thick growth around the edge of the tailings, and that can help us identify some of those. So at the moment, we're even working on where the tailings are, which is terrifying. But there's a lot of hope. Finally, environmentalists, geologists, and engineers are working together to try and come up with a plan of how to actually categorize these. The other difficult things is that tailings are inherently hard to analyze. If you can imagine stuff that's so fine-grained, how do you identify the minerals? You've got to use something like electron microscopy. And that's possible, but it takes time and experience. So you need to find those mineralogists from hard rock mining who are then interested in merging their skills to an environmental slant. So actually developing scientists to be able to even sort of categorize these tailings is still difficult. But from the initial work we've done, it shows really promising we looked at some silver and zinc deposits and found a good amount of things like gallium in them, which is really sort of critical to know that, no pun intended, but to also understand how the minerals even interact together and decompose over time in tailings as well. So there's a lot of work that can be done, but it looks really promising at the moment. So stay tuned.
Actually, I have a related question there. Is once you get these minerals, how do you separate them from each other? I know with things like rare earths, the big problem is not that they're rare, because rare earths are not. It's finding them concentrated and then separating them from each other. The single U.S. plant that separates rare earths does it by differential solubility in hydrochloric acid. And so basically what you do if that is gobbledygook to you, what they do is they dissolve all of the minerals in concentrated hydrochloric acid. Then they raise the pH, and at different pHs, different ones of the rare earths will fall out. And so at the very end, you have an enormous amount of very acidic sludge that you have to get rid of. How do you face that problem with the tailings minerals you're getting?
Yeah, so that's another thing that we're looking at. And actually, the biomedical industry is giving some hints about how to process these incredibly fine materials. There are a number of drug developments that are actually helping in working out how to separate these tailings. It's not only that they're very fine and we want to separate out the different minerals. Imagine if the minerals are combined. Some of those minerals are going to have the effect of the host mineral. So how do we even work out how to get the mineral we want out of the mineral it's hosted in? So there are many different ways. You can crush it. That's a very old school technique. Shaker tables, if anybody's seen that sort of gravity-driven separation. We have liquid separation, and then we have these new ways of separating that are sort of coming online. And the U's actually been really, really instrumental in designing some of these. So the chemical engineering department works on a lot of this kind of stuff. So there's a lot going on in the space, and we're now trying to kind of merge the characterization piece with the reprocessing piece to really work out what we've got and how do we get it out.
Thank you. One question for Rachel that I thought was very interesting is, could you describe the permitting process you went through for the Thatcher Peak mine? Since we talked about permitting processes, we have somebody who's actually gone through it.
Right up. Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, so it took us a minute to get through the permitting process. But of course, the permitting process does start with baseline studies. So that was a critical piece of this. Actually, the company that we bought the project from, the Thacker Pass project from, had done some data collection. So that got us a little bit started, and then we continued to do a lot more. And so there's really three sort of separate types of permitting that we had to do. There's federal permitting, and then there's your state permitting, and then there's your county permitting. And so the county level permitting, that's all sort of construction-based permitting for the most part. The state permitting, that was a lot of air, water. Nevada has very serious reclamation laws, so doing a lot of work with that. And then at the federal permitting, we're on BLM land, so getting the BLM permits was sort of the ultimate biggest step for us. But then there was sort of an added step where we went to court over these permits to litigate whether they were valid, and they were found to be valid. We got our record of decision last year. So that is a big part of the process, unfortunately, in the US, is that most mining companies end up in court over their permits. So you have to go through and prove your permits, but the data was on our side, and we showed what we had, and the litigation was on our side. So we got our permits finalized last year. There is just a slight bit of last litigation about water rights, just to make sure that our water rights are proper, and they are, and so we're just finishing up that litigation. But that's pretty much been the process, and I don't want to exactly say the numbers, but I know we submitted some of our first federal permits in 2018, 2019, so it's taken us several years to get through that process.
Okay, so you're talking about 6 or 7 years. At what point were the tribal representatives brought into your planning process?
Yeah, so we did that immediately. So once the project was taken over, I was not part of the team at that point, but when the project was taken over, immediate consultation was started before we started any mine planning, any of that. Unfortunately, the pandemic was a bit of a challenge for us because we weren't able to go to community meetings, we weren't able to have in-person discussions, and unfortunately, misinformation blossomed in that space. And so we've had to do a lot of work just making sure that we've stayed engaged with the community. So we've been doing over 10 years of consultation with the local communities, and what we ultimately ended up doing, which I think can be a good strategy for a lot of different mining companies, is we brought in an outside mediator. So we paid for the mediator so that it wasn't a financial burden, but this is a third-party mediator who comes in and mediates the community benefits agreement, our agreements about roads, about building schools, about doing all of the things that we can do as good neighbors. And so I think that was a really critical part of our project, was starting that consultation really early and getting support from the local community.
Now that you've done it all, is everybody happy with the results?
I would say certainly the majority of people are. I think the local communities are very excited about the economic opportunities, about our ability to be responsible in this project, about their abilities to participate in all aspects of the project, from archaeological digs that were done to actually being part of the processing, to having engineering jobs, human resources jobs, whatever that may be. And so we have a lot of support from the community. The tribe voted on the community benefits agreement and voted in favor of it. So we have tribal support, and we have a lot of local community support just outside of our immediate area, all the way to Winnemucca and the surrounding sort of mining areas. So we're very happy with the results. I can say that just on a personal note, I'm very proud to work on this project. I have a pretty strong environmentalist background, so getting into mining was a bit of a risk for me, but I'm really proud to be operating on a project that really is taking their responsibility so seriously and thinking about all these little aspects in every possible way that we can.
Thank you. Jamie, one question for you, and that is, I know I lived in Oklahoma for 30 years, and there were thousands of abandoned oil wells in Oklahoma. And finally, the Oklahoma Oil Producers Association got together and basically cleaned up most of those wells at the expense of the oil producers. Do you know of any, in fact, this would be for you too as well, do you know of any similar movement in the mining industry to help clean up some of these old mine tailings areas, since it's already been shown that it's possible and that industry has funded it?
I'm going to guess that Steve has more knowledge than I do on this, but the one thing I would say that I am familiar with is in coal, in the context of coal, they ended up, they being, I guess, the regulatory, the law, but I'm assuming it was at the request of the coal companies. They ended up putting a fee on coal, and then that went into a generalized fund, and then that fund was used to reclaim abandoned coal mines. There's not something that's similar with respect to hard rock mining, and I'll let you add on to.
Sure thing. And, picking up on one of the themes from earlier in terms of tailings piles or also just other environmental contamination that's left over, we do hear from a lot of mining companies that are interested in potentially remediating those areas or, processing those tailings, but the legal problems there, especially under the Clean Water Act or Superfund, often makes them very hesitant to do that. So that is one voluntary measure that they have suggested. So that would be Good Samaritan protections get proposed in Congress quite often. I believe one just got through the Senate Energy Committee, so or Environmental Public Works. Anyway, it's moving, so we might see something get through Congress this year. On the other side, there's also the National Mining Association has said that they would support a modest royalty on hard rock mineral production in the U.S. They've suggested 2% of net revenues, with those funds going to abandoned hard rock mine remediation, because they also understand not only is this an environmental problem, it's a justice problem, it's also an image and a trust problem for the industry. Certainly people are not going to be very welcoming of the mining industry if there are all these abandoned mines out there polluting streams, harming wildlife, and so on. So there are other proposals in our report. We actually have a number of options listed for ways to raise money for this.
Thank you. So there is hope out there. It just hasn't quite happened yet.
That's right.
Rachel, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. And it's probably useful for people who are out in the audience to know what exactly is reclamation, because some people expect, well, when this land is reclaimed, we're going to have the Garden of Eden out in northern Nevada. What should people be looking at when you're talking about reclamation?
Right, yeah, that's a great question. So I think reclamation is many-sided. So for us, there's sort of the aesthetic piece, which is returning the land to what it looks like now. So that's topography, that's stabilizing slopes. That's right now we're under construction. We started construction last year. So what's going on right now is that we're actually just moving the topsoil. So we're picking it up in these big chunks and moving it over to a place where we're going to store the topsoil. And then we're going to put that back once we're done with this project. So we're storing the topsoil, we're going through that process. So there's the aesthetic piece, and then there is sort of the wildlife and vegetation piece of that, and making sure that we go through that. So right now, if you go out to Thacker Pass, it's mostly cheatgrass, which, if anybody has walked around Nevada, is awful. It gets stuck in your shoes, and it's a super invasive species. And that's really what's taken over that area right now. It's not great habitat for most creatures out there. And so what we're hoping to do is actually leave it better than we found it and reseed that with the native BLM seed mix that has all of the native species in it. We've got seed banks already started, so we've got plenty of seeds to be able to do this. And so that's a big piece of it as well, is reseeding this area in hopefully a way that makes it even healthier. And then we have dry stack tailings, so we will not have any issues with dam breaks because we don't have a dam and we don't have any wet tailings. So that's going to be really important. So that's the only addition to the topography, is going to be a hill of clay that's totally inert, very safe, and we will also resoil that. So the reclamation is sort of many-pieced.
Okay. Both Steve and Brian, you may want to comment on this one. Someone asked, are there any current federal incentives for dealing with reclamation of minerals from tailings? And if so, what's happening in that area?
As far as I know, there are none federally.
No, not that I'm aware of either. I will say, if anything, it's not just the liability under the Clean Water Act or CERCLA that can be an issue. there are a lot of other issues about remining tailings or reprocessing tailings. And we actually have a group right now in the federal government called the Federal Mining Dialogue that is comprised of experts from a number of different federal agencies. And they are going through and trying to identify all of the different regulatory or legislative hurdles that are blocking this from happening. And then they hopefully will produce a report with some recommendations that we can then try to move on to make this a little bit easier.
I think working with several companies, it's become very clear that companies are absolutely terrified of tailings. And like I said, that's kind of justified. I mean, they have a lot of really nasty things in them. And so I've worked with Jamie on some of this as well, looking at whether Good Samaritan laws are applicable to areas, and even sort of no one really knows what they're on the hook for when they touch tailings. So as you said, to work out what those things are, to try and make this process less terrifying. And the difficult thing is that a lot of the grants that will allow us to work further on tailings need industry cooperation. So, if you're working with industry and they don't 100% trust you, they don't want you touching them either, because they're still on the hook. So even doing this foundational research about tailings means we have to have cooperative industry partners. So that has also been another facet of this, to even do the initial research. Can we get access? So lots of things to do.
A related question that I'm going to throw open to any of you on the panel who want to talk about it is that the mining industry historically has a very bad reputation for making messes and not cleaning them up. And the messes persist forever, essentially. What do you think the industry should be doing, and what do you think they are doing now to remedy that problem?
I'll just go straight ahead and say companies like the one that Rachel works for, that kind of is the future that I'm hoping for. We don't want companies to say they're not going to mine. They just need to mine responsibly. And that's all we're asking for. A company that interacts with the community, with environmentalists, so that there's this ongoing dialogue. There's always going to be problems, but it's whether we can talk about those and find a better solution. So I think the future is companies that are responsible. And those are the companies that we should all sort of back, just to show that they are some of these companies. It is possible to do that. Hearing that tailings aren't going to sit is incredible. To hear that there's not going to be a scar on the land from a mine is something that's so hopeful to me as a geologist.
Yeah, I guess I'll add on to that because I think everybody who works at our company is very proud of this fact. But I think in order to do this, you really need the science and the data before you can go ahead and do this as responsibly as possible. And so that's a big part of this, is immediately starting environmental studies, getting, as we talked about yesterday, not just one day of wildlife surveys, but years of wildlife surveys. We did, fish DNA surveys of our streams to make sure there was no fish that we were going to be impacting, let alone endangered fish. And so things like that can really help with doing this in a really progressive way, and doing this in a way that is not like what we've done in the past. And I think you're so right. There's a well-deserved bad reputation out there. And so the only thing that we can do is go forward and try to change that. And so that takes a lot of communication, that takes a lot of data collecting and time, but it's worth it to do these projects correctly at the beginning, so that we don't even have to deal with these super fun sites after the fact, and we don't have to even think about these horrible repercussions that we've often left.
Jamie, you look like you want to say something here.
Yes, I think that, I think that there are exciting things like Lithium Americas and other. One trend that I've noticed is that there is an increasing push internationally for companies who are recognizing that it's not just the regulatory regime that they have to deal with. They have to obtain a social license. And so figuring out, I can get through the regulatory regime by making it easier, or, depending on what companies do in different countries. I'm not going to cast aspersions, but suggest that there might be ways to get permits. But if you do that and you don't have a social license, what they're learning is your mine won't operate. It won't work. And so there are some companies who are recognizing that's a financial risk, and we are going to establish standards, we're going to develop best practices, and we're going to adhere to those in an effort to obtain social license. And I think those companies are driving some really interesting trends, like developing voluntary international standards. And those standards can actually be leveraged geopolitically and internationally to come up with agreements that say, among our trade partners, we'll only source from mining companies that adhere to these more responsible standards or these voluntary standards. So you could have almost an interfacing of international standards that actually also address that risk that we have trade partners who are big developers and also have a very poor environmental record. I will also say that those are not all companies. So I think this has been an extremely optimistic panel, which is really great. But I don't want to walk away ignoring the fact that there are also bad operators out there. And if those bad operators are allowed to operate without adhering to those higher standards, that makes it really hard for companies that adhere to these voluntary standards to compete with them, because it's expensive to do all of that voluntary work, all of that upfront work of obtaining baseline studies, of engaging with the communities. It takes time and it's expensive. And if we allow operators to not follow those standards and still go into operation, to have a low bond or to get their bond back with a shoddy reclamation deal, then taxpayers are the ones who end up having to clean up these mines. And so really thinking through, the consequence of allowing a lax regime as opposed to saying, like, no, there will be a strict regime. I think that's another important element to think about during the conversation.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that because of what you said earlier about we don't need to loosen these regulations. And I think that was one thing that we really wanted to show, was that capitalism is fine. We're going to be a profitable company. We're all, happy to be part of it, but that you can do it at the same time, and that financial trade-off doesn't have to be there. Because I think for a long time there has just been an assumption that, we just can't compete with these companies that are undercutting us and cutting corners and taking shortcuts. And so I hope that we can be an example that you can do both. You can be a financially viable company, a successful company, but also be responsible about it. So it's a challenge. I think you're absolutely right. It's not easy to do all those pieces, to have all those members of your team, to make sure that all those pieces are taken care of. It's really a challenge. And so that's, I think, one of the central things that all mining companies really have to think about.
Let me point out one major problem with that, and that is we're talking about within the United States you can do things, but consider cobalt. 80% of the world's cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has essentially been in a condition of civil war for as long as anybody can remember. Much of the mining in cobalt is what's called artisanal mining. And what that boils down to is a bunch of 14-year-old boys sitting around in a mine with a hammer, whacking away the overburden to get to the cobalt ore, which is then shipped to China. And China refines about 75% of the world's cobalt to make metal, and they are not known for adhering to the kinds of standards that we insist on in the United States. Steve, maybe this is more your department than anybody. Do you have any comments on how the United States will stay competitive with people who like to cut corners?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a tough question. And at the Department of the Interior, we don't quite tackle that directly, although the U.S. Geological Survey does do a lot of supply chain mapping and supply chain research to look at, to understand the mineral flows and where certain minerals are coming from, and, if we try to make changes in that. I will say they're also working on a mine waste inventory right now. So hopefully we'll have more information from that. But I will say the administration is very focused on these questions internationally. There is a lot of interagency work that's happening between a ton of different agencies in the administration. So the State Department, USAID, Commerce, Energy, us, EPA, we are working together a lot to tackle these questions and to figure out how we can get other countries to raise their standards without, making it tougher for, well, I mean, that's actually the goal, is to get other countries to raise their standards so that everyone's operating on a level playing field, and it's difficult.
Incidentally, it's worth noting, I've seen Apple's statement of corporate responsibility. They will not buy from people who don't play by the rules, but they still buy cobalt from the Congo.
Can I add to that?
Yes, go ahead.
I think, I hear that argument a lot, and one thing that I am realizing more and more is that that's a very easy example, but there's a lot of space in the middle as well. It's not just the DRC or the United States. There's also Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Australia. There are a lot of other countries that do have quite innovative, good, strong regulatory regimes that are also producers.
Yeah, and I think this is one reason to do it here in the U.S. and in nearby countries. I think we've, over the last several decades, not in my backyardism has really taken hold, and people have basically shipped this industry overseas. And the problem with that is that there often aren't regulations, or you don't know the regulations, or it's hard to tell. And so doing it here in the U.S. means there's oversight, means the communities are involved, means that we can process it here in the U.S. and have those fair prices and have, a market that reacts appropriately. And I think that that will drive competition if we have a domestic supply chain of these elements, of these minerals, or even, close domestic supply chain. Mexico, Canada, tons of resources right here. And so I think that that's an important thing to tap into and do it responsibly. And that will, I think, in my opinion, I think that will drive the whole industry forward. So I do think that's important.
Thank you. We have a number of questions that deal with the role of recycling. Since basically what you're doing with mine tailings is recycling, how much will recycling affect, for example, the amount of lithium? Because I've got a jar in my garage with a whole bunch of used lithium-ion batteries that I'm going to turn in to be recycled. Go ahead.
So a lot of the time, sadly, we can't recycle stuff, or we don't have the technology in place to make it economically feasible. And I'm sure you can speak to this as well. We don't actually. A lot of the problems are even trying to get this stuff back to a state we can use it again. And this is where we need the interplay of technology and science to move these forward at the same time as mining. There's not a do or don't. It's a let's try and use everything we've got. So I'm sure you can speak to this as well. We need lithium mines because recycling batteries is actually quite difficult.
Yeah, I think I had a professor once tell me that metallurgy is just undoing whatever the earth did. And that's really what this whole thing is about. And so when you have something that's wrapped up in a battery, what we've essentially done is tie it together as tightly as we possibly can. And that's really hard to break back open and kind of get all that back out. And so I think that that is sort of one of the challenges. We do have ways of doing it, but like you mentioned, it's not economic yet. And so working towards those technologies that are going to make that more efficient, make that more economic, is going to take, like you said, engineering and science together to figure that out.
Yeah, and I'll just add, the administration strongly supports circular economy and trying to increase recycling and try and manufacture products in ways that make them easier to recycle. However, if you look at the demand for minerals that's coming in the future, if you recycled 100% of the lithium that had been processed on Earth right now, you would still need more. So there are studies that look at exactly what percent of demand we can address with recycling over the next 10, 15 years, and it's not that much it's not very high percentage.
I've seen the numbers. In lithium in particular, if you recycled every lithium battery that's out there, 5 years from now, that would account for 20% of the lithium demand. So no matter how well we recycle, we're still going to need mining, and we're going to need responsible mining. We have about 3.5 more minutes before they cut us off. I have more questions about lithium. A lot of people want to know about lithium from brine. That may or may not be your area of expertise, but could you tell us a little bit about lithium from brine, pluses and minuses? I know there was a company that wanted to mine lithium from Salt Lake, Great Salt Lake brine.
Yes.
Gave up on it, but
Yeah. So traditionally, the way we've mined brine is by taking these aquifers that are saline, salty aquifers, and what we do in the Atacama Desert of the Andes, so Chile, Argentina, is we actually pump that to the surface and we put it in these very big ponds, like we're talking like a kilometer squared kind of ponds. They're huge. But in the Atacama Desert, they actually take up a very small percentage of that space. And so you put these in these big ponds, and that sun is just so powerful that it actually evaporates some of that water, and we concentrate it down and put some chemistry into these ponds. And what we actually can do is come up with lithium carbonate by the end of it. So the pro of that is, as I mentioned about metallurgy, we're undoing what the Earth did. The Earth put the lithium in water. That's so awesome. It's just right there. We can use the energy of the sun. It's great. It's super easy to get the lithium out of that process. It does take time to get it up and running. So you have to get the lithium moving through all 12 sitting ponds, and that takes about a year. So once you're online, it takes about a year to start producing. So that can be a challenge. And then, of course, the main drawback to this, there's sort of two environmental factors that you really have to be conscious of. That's the drawdown of aquifers and subsidence that can result. So hydrologic studies at the beginning of any brine operation are critical to understand which aquifers are connected. Is our saline salty aquifer connected to a freshwater aquifer that we're accidentally going to draw down? That's a problem. So really making sure that we understand the connections of the hydrology in our basins is critical for brine projects. And then the second thing is the amount of space those ponds take up. They can take a lot of space, so doing studies on how the vicuña run through the desert, making sure that we understand how the mountain lions are, or the pumas are interacting with those ponds. And so far the environmental studies have all been really positive. But there is now new technologies that are trying to be developed to process these brines, and that's called direct lithium extraction. And that's something that is in the works, and I'm very hopeful for all the engineers out there working on that problem. It is not something that we've been able to do at scale yet, but there's been a lot of news about Chevron getting into this space in the Smackover Formation, which is in the southeast. So that could be a way here in the US where we lack the sun and we lack the amount of space to do that traditional brine processing, where we could get brines here in the US from direct lithium extraction. Direct lithium extraction often is put out there like some environmental magic wand where it has no downsides. It also has downsides, and that's a really important thing to think about as we think about how we institute that technology.
thank you very much. This has been a very informative panel. We've had a number of interesting points of view, a lot of interesting data. Thank you all for the time and effort you've expended. I think for all of us, including the audience and me, we have learned a lot. It's been well worth our time. And thank you to the Stegner Symposium for allowing us to talk with you. And thank you for the good questions that have been asked. I think any of us in the panel would be happy to be buttonholed by somebody who has more questions related to the areas that we work in. So thanks again to all, and we'll end at this point and get ready for the next group. Thank you.